There are several online Git repository service providers. Two of the most popular ones are GitHub and Bitbucket. I will go through in more detail about how you can set up your Git repository that you prepared in the previous exercise to be mirrored on an online Git repository on Bitbucket. To set up an online Git repository, go to one of these online service providers and then sign up for an account. So here I have signed up into my Bitbucket account, and I have my homepage open here. And so I'm going to create a new repository online on my Bitbucket repository. So I just click on the create repository, and then this would come up with some details. Now this varies with the repository service provider. So here I will specify the name of the repository as git-test, and then I'm going to mark this as a private repository. For this course and all the remaining courses in the specialization, I would strongly advise you to keep your repositories as private repositories, because you don't want somebody else to be copying the code that you might save in your online Git repository. So please make sure that you only use private repositories in this specialization. So I will sign up as a Git private repository and then simply click on create repository, and then it'll do some setup and then be ready for me. Okay. Now what I need to do is to copy this particular URL for my repository. So you will see a URL for the repository in the home page of that repository. So just copy that URL for the repository, because we would need that in order to synchronize our local Git repository with this repository. So I'm going to copy that. And since I have already created my local Git repository, I'm going to go in there and set that up to be mirrored in this online Git repository. So for that, we need to use a couple of Git commands that enable us to do this. Going to the command prompt in my Git repository folder, I will type git remote add origin and then paste the URL for my Bitbucket repository that I've just created and hit the return. So now my local Git repository's remote origin is set to the Bitbucket repository. So now I want to be able to push the entire contents of my local Git repository to my online Git repository. So reviewing the commands for setting up the online Git repository, the first one that we just did, git remote add origin and the repository URL. And so this will add the online repository as the remote repository for my local Git repository. Once I do that, then I need to push my contents to my online repository. For that, I do git push -u origin master. And this command would push the local Git repository to the online repository. So let's type that at the command prompt. So once I type this at the command prompt and hit the return, it's going to set up my Git repository. Sometimes it may ask you to type in your credentials, including your password on your Bitbucket account. So you may have to do that. I had already done that previously, so that's why it didn't ask me again for the password. But once I type that in, then the contents of my local Git repository will be pushed to the server side. So now the data on my local Git repository is now matched on the server side. So let's go to Bitbucket to see the status of my online Git repository now. Going to my Bitbucket and then reviewing the online Git repository, you would see that there has been a branch, the master branch that has been pushed to my online Git repository. I can then examine the source by looking at the source here, and then you can see that I have the index.html file, which is exactly the same as what I have in my local Git repository, and examine the various commits also. So I can look at the state in the second commit and at the first commit. So you can now see that all this information has been uploaded to the online repository, including the history of all the commits. Then going back there, you can see more details about all the commits that have been sent to the server side. I can examine each of those commits in a bit more detail. And then going back to the source, I can look at more details of the source like that there. So that has now set up my local Git repository to be mirrored in Bitbucket.